Minister for Indigenous Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be here on Algonquin territory to rise to speak to the motion from the member of Timmins James Bay, and I want to thank the honourable member for affording me the opportunity to discuss this truly important issue and to address any misunderstandings and to update this House on the progress that we are making. Mr. Speaker, as Minister, I've been mandated by the Prime Minister to engage in a renewed nation-to-nation process with Indigenous peoples to make real progress on the issues most important to Indigenous people, including child welfare.
We promised to establish a new relationship with Indigenous people and a new way of doing things. We intend to keep our promise.
Priority as parliamentarians and as responsible Canadians must be first and foremost the health, well-being and protection of Indigenous children. All Canadians want children to have the best chance in life. First Nations children, however, do not always have the same access to quality health and social services, and way too often have been apprehended and placed in situations where they have suffered abuse and where they are removed from their culture and therefore lose the personal cultural identity, which is essential for optimal health, education, and economic outcomes. This is shameful and has to change. For years, I've been outspoken on the need to reform this system. The fact that there are more children in care than at the height of residential schools is heartbreaking.
The first 5 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report recognize the need to work together to fight against that shortcoming. I intend to honour this obligation and to act without delay.
Motion in the context of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision on child and family services. I want to state clearly that the government welcomed the decision of the tribunal, and we were working to implement its findings, including ending the discriminatory practices identified by the tribunal. But we were working on this regardless of what the tribunal had said. We need to make the reforms. In my view, one of the most important factors is that discrimination is the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care. These children are separated from their families, at risk for losing their culture and identity and language, and even worse, facing abuses and violence, as was demonstrated by the member's speech. It is the current system that causes this, and we can and will do better by these children. The tribunal has said that it believes the federal government is, quote, determined to reform the entire First Nations Child and Family Services program, and it believes it intends to do so, end quote. We are and we will. Jour après jour.
Day after day, Dr. Philpott and myself have worked tirelessly to ensure that First Nations children really have access to the health and social services that they are entitled to.
At the Assembly of First Nations Special Chiefs Assembly, I committed to work to an overhaul of the child welfare system on reserve. I meant what I said that day. We are committed to nothing less than a full-scale reform of child and family services on reserve, and are undertaking that reform in partnership with the provinces and territories and First Nations. We are actively reaching out to partners across the country to jointly develop options for reform. This includes working in partnership with the First Nations organizations, leadership, communities, frontline service providers and agencies, non-governmental organizations, other federal departments, as well as the provinces and territories to meaningfully reform the First Nations Child and Family Services program. We need transformational change, and the goal of the child welfare system must be to reduce the disproportionate number of children in care, full stop. The member's speech actually spoke to the needs for reform, but unfortunately that is not in this motion. Mr. Speaker, as a first step, we know we need to end the funding discrimination endemic in the First Nations child welfare system. Budget 2016 announced an investment of $634.8 million over 5 years to support the immediate needs of First Nations children on reserve. This included $71 million in immediate relief investments to First Nations Child and Family Services. The immediate relief was focused on providing additional enhanced prevention services in every province and the Yukon Territory, which was also a previous discrimination. We agree with the tribunal that future funding but not be based on an arbitrary formula or figure created behind closed doors in Ottawa. Rather, it must be based on the actual day-to-day needs of agencies. It must be based on what it will take to operationalize transformational reform and to keep kids out of care and in their communities. We also agree that Jordan's principle applies to all First Nations children, and we are already applying the full meaning and scope of Jordan's principle. Children are getting their needs met.
I am proud to report that since the changes brought in last July, nearly 900 children from all provinces and territories have been identified to receive services under the expanded definition of Jordan's principle. These are children who would not have had access to these services before that.
Concrete first steps in addressing the most pressing concerns. But it isn't only about money. Building something new, something different, means we need to talk to the people who are most involved. This new approach means moving forward in our relationships. We want to be accountable for results, keeping more families together, and reducing the number of kids in care. It's no longer satisfactory that the federal government pays and the provinces in Yukon to deliver services without any say in the results. The current system has left kids suffering, taken from their families and their communities. One need to look no further than the recent report from the BC Child Advocate to see the tragic results of how this system fails kids. Or to what we heard time and time again during our consultations on the design of the National Public Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the direct connection between the failure of the child welfare system, both to the children that were taken and to the women and the mothers that were left behind. Or to the story of Rena Foster, who I was lucky enough to spend the day with in early October as part of the celebration of International Day of the Girl. Rena was put in foster care when she was just 2. It was the first of 6 foster homes she lived in, during which she both witnessed and experienced abuse. As I said that day, Rena spoke truth to power in a very poignant way. It reaffirmed my understanding about the need to listen to people who are affected by the policies like child welfare. We have been listening to the concerns of First Nations communities and organizations regarding the child welfare system. As I said, Mr. Speaker, we agree that it needs a total overhaul, and we are taking action. On September 22nd, I was pleased to appoint Dr. Cynthia Wesley Eskimo as my special representative responsible for leading the engagement process on the total reform of the On-Reserve First Nations Child and Family Services Program. Dr. Wesley Eskimo is a member of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation in Ontario. Has the chair in Truth and Reconciliation at Lakehead University and has spent her whole career advocating for and advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples. This appointment represents a key step in our commitment to engaging with all the provinces and territories and all partners for the full-scale reform of the First Nations Child and Family Service Program. Mr. Speaker, this is important as we need to transform the system with the benefit of hearing directly from youth and incorporating their lived experiences into any new approach. The voices of the children who participated in the Feathers of Hope gathering echo in my ears every day. The feather they gave me sits on my desk, reminding me of this important work on a daily basis. They have told me their difficult stories of abuse, being separated from siblings, of being told that their culture, their beliefs, and their traditions were inferior. We have taken a number of concrete steps. Dr. Wesley Eskimo has begun consultations on reform, which will run coast to coast to coast. This afternoon, she will be meeting with all of the provincial child advocates. We are surveying all agencies to better understand their unique and individual needs and circumstances, and we are committed to identifying best practices that achieve real and culturally appropriate results for kids. These models include things like Touchstones of Hope, championed by Cindy Blackstock, and the Maori Family Conferencing model, highlighted by Mama Wee Chidata in Manitoba. The federal government is also a full partner at tripartite meetings with provinces and the Yukon and First Nations and agencies to discuss real reforms in the system. We are funding Indigenous regional organizations to hold meetings and gather strategic information that it can inform the reform process. We will be meeting with child advocates and other provincial Yukon stakeholders, and we are working to reestablish the National Advisory Committee to provide advice on the engagement process and the reform of this program. The committee will include representatives from federal government, the Assembly of First Nations, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, agency directors, and an elder and a youth representative. We are also planning for a national summit on Indigenous child welfare for early 2017. The summit will bring together key stakeholders, hear from youth in care, service providers, child advocates, First Nations community representatives, researchers, and others to share information about the wise practices in prevention and how to support children and families. Mr. Speaker, there is a federal, provincial, territorial working group involving senior officials who work on child and family services to share information and best practices. I will also be working with the Minister of Families, Child and Social Development to launch the consultations with provinces and territories and Indigenous peoples on a national early learning and childcare framework. We know how important affordable, high-quality, flexible, and fully inclusive childcare is, but we also know that for Indigenous children, care must be culturally appropriate and supportive of language and culture. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell you with confidence that through our concrete action, we are working hard to end discriminatory practices.
Steps to, in the Gitsin phrase, upright the canoe. Mr. Speaker, we know real reform doesn't happen overnight, but we must be relentlessly focused on driving this reform. We have to understand that removing First Nations children from their families, from their communities, and from their language and culture creates lasting damage. This was what was meant by the motto of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. For the child taken, for the parent left behind. That must be and will be our motto as we reform the system once and for all and put First Nations kids first. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Miigwech Kuyanomik.